History did not merely turn a page in Islamabad. It slammed the book shut on the era of Western diplomatic hegemony with a finality that echoed across the Hindu Kush. The world watched, paralyzed by a mixture of awe and terror, as a flight designated Minab 168 descended into the heart of the crisis, carrying the heavy, suffocating weight. This weight was a tragedy the mainstream media has long buried under layers of sanitized press releases and state-sponsored amnesia. This was not just a diplomatic mission. It was not a routine shuttle. It was an existential reckoning for an empire that has forgotten how to negotiate without a gun held to the head of its adversary. A realization that the gun is now jammed. 3 questions now define the operational window of the next decade, and the answers will determine who survives the coming storm. First, why did the United States delegation choose to incinerate the peace? Led by a vice president who appears to report directly to a foreign capital in the Levant, why choose to incinerate the peace process at the very moment it was most needed? Second, how did the Iranian military architecture remain not only functional, but lethal after 40 days of saturation strikes by a global coalition that promised to return them to the Stone Age? Third, what is the mathematical reality of a global economy when the pulse of the Strait of Hormuz, the jugular of the modern world, stops beating for more than 72 hours? The flight itself was a lexical fingerprint of Iranian strategic communication, a masterclass in the semiotics of resistance. Tehran sent an unambiguous message before the first word was ever spoken. By naming the aircraft after the 168 children vaporized in a school by American Tomahawk missiles, they highlighted figures Washington refuses to acknowledge, let even apologize for. These were the physical receipts of a history. The plane was a flying monument to a grievance that has been distilled into a doctrine of total self-reliance and asymmetric vengeance. The strike on Minab was the first wave of a calculated assault, a moment where targets are vetted with the highest precision, only to be ignored in favor of psychological impact. The Iranians understand with cold, clinical clarity that in the logic of total war, hitting a school where the fathers are military personnel is not a mistake. It is a calculated attempt. They aim to inflict qualitative military paralysis by breaking the will of the warrior class. To suggest this was an accident in an era of high-resolution mapping is a mythology. It is a lie designed for the consumption of a domestic audience that prefers comfort over the brutal truth. When the Speaker of the Parliament boarded that plane, he did not sit in luxury. He sat among the framed photos of the dead, declaring them his primary negotiating team. This is the language of a state that has moved past the need for Western approval. This state has crossed the Rubicon of international isolation and found a strange, terrifying strength. It is a stark contrast to official narratives flowing out of the Washington Post and New York Times. These papers recently published opinion pieces effectively calling for the assassination of the very negotiators sitting across the table. The West talks rules-based order while the East prepares for the final audit. The journey back to Tehran was a masterclass in tactical evasion and strategic paranoia. Fearing the United States or the Israeli regime might shoot down the delegation, the flight performed a descent, hugging the jagged peaks of the borderlands near Afghanistan and Turkmenistan. the delegation moved by land, utilizing a network of hardened tunnels and decoy convoys, leaving the hunters staring at empty radar screens. The hunters have become the haunted, chasing ghosts in a landscape they no longer control. The Islamabad talks collapsed because the Trump administration is operating under a lethal delusion of total victory. After 40 days of conflict, characterized by the largest drone swarms in history and the failure of Aegis defense systems, it was the United States, not Iran, that was desperately seeking a ceasefire. The initial demand for unconditional surrender had dissolved into a desperate 15-point plan that was rejected out of hand for violating the core tenets of Iranian sovereignty. You cannot demand the keys. Iran only accepted a halt in hostilities when the United States agreed to negotiate based on Tehran's own 10-point proposal, a document written in the ink of defiance. This was a strategic defeat. The Iranians entered these talks with zero optimism, knowing that dealing with a leadership that flip-flops, contradicts its own intelligence reports, and suffers from chronic strategic amnesia is a mathematical impossibility. They did not come to find peace. They came to document the West's inability to offer it. The optics in the negotiating room were telling of a deeper structural want in American power. While the Iranian lead negotiator, Dr. Ali Bagheri Khani, operated with the full authority of the supreme leader, Vice President J.D. Vance was tethered to an encrypted telephone line like a puppet. He was constantly reporting back to Benjamin Netanyahu, a reality that the Israeli Prime Minister later broadcasted to the world as a mark of his own dominance over American foreign policy. The leader of the free world was reduced to a middleman for a regional actor. Surrounded by two prominent Zionists, Kushner and Witkoff, Vance was a man without an independent operational window. The priorities at the table were not the needs of the American people, nor were they the stability of the global energy market or the safety of American sailors in the Gulf. They were the specific, narrow requirements of a tiny regime in Tel Aviv that views regional conflagration as its only path to survival. This subordination of the American vice presidency has no parallel. It is the definition of a captured state operating against its own national interest to satisfy the demands of an external architect. The Iranian side was not surprised by the theatrical exit. They have watched this script play out before, from the JCPOA to the various red lines that turned out to be pink at best. They know negotiations are often used as a smokescreen. Iran negotiates not out of a hope for peace, but to demonstrate to the global public and its own citizens that it is the only rational actor in a room full of pyromaniacs. They are building the legal and moral case for the escalation they know is inevitable. The nuclear issue remains the crown jewel of Iranian sovereignty and a non-negotiable pillar of their identity. Uranium enrichment is not merely a technical process, it is the lifeblood of their future energy independence and their ultimate insurance policy against the fate of Libya or Iraq. For a nation that has lived under the boot of crushing sanctions for 45 years, the ability to produce its own nuclear fuel is the only guarantee against economic strangulation. To them, the atom is the ultimate symbol of the scientific jihad, a refusal to be relegated to a third-tier resource colony. When the United States demands a 20-year suspension, they demand surrender. The Islamic Revolution of 1979 was fought precisely to end this kind of external dictation. To the Iranians, the high cost of this independence has already been paid in blood. They will not trade a generational achievement for a temporary reprieve from sanctions that they have already learned to bypass through the shadows of the global financial system. The economic disparity between the two worlds is captured most vividly in the price of gasoline. In Iran, fuel costs between 1 cent and 2 cents per liter, incomprehensible to the Western consumer. This massive subsidy is the social contract that keeps the nation unified. It makes the Iranian economy highly sensitive to fuel security, driving the strategic necessity for self-sufficiency in every sector. While the West worries about green transitions, Iran has focused on survival transitions, ensuring that no matter how many refineries are hit, the pulse of the nation continues. The accusations of human rights violations and terrorism coming from the West are viewed in Tehran as a grotesque theater of the absurd, a comedy of hypocrisies. They see the ongoing genocide carried out with Western munitions and funded by Western taxpayers. This genocide in Lebanon and Gaza is the ultimate disqualification of the West as a moral arbiter. In their eyes, the pilots who bombed the Minab school and the politicians who signed the checks for the white phosphorus are the true face of international terrorism. They no longer defend. They no longer recognize that world as civilized. Even within the American intelligence establishment, the cracks are beginning to show, and the leaks are becoming a flood. High-level appointees, veterans of the CIA and the DIA, have admitted in scathing resignation letters that Iran is not the existential threat the politicians claim it to be. They have stated clearly that Tehran is not building a nuclear weapon, but rather a threshold capability, a nuance that is lost on a Congress bought and paid for by lobbyists. The drive for war is not fueled by intelligence. It is fueled by the relentless, grinding machinery of a Zionist architecture that views any independent power in the Middle East as a virus. The current blockade of Iranian ports in the Strait of Hormuz is a move of strategic desperation that may hurt America's allies far more than its enemy. Iran is not small. It is a massive landmass with 15 neighbors, ranging from nuclear-armed Pakistan to the rising power of Russia. It has spent years diversifying its trade routes, building the international north-south transport corridor. A blockade of the sea is merely an inconvenience when you have mastered the land. Contrary to the Western image of a desert wasteland, Iran is a land of two massive mountain ranges. The Alborz and the Zagros peaks, some reaching over 18,000 feet, are currently covered in deep snow, feeding a complex hydraulic and agricultural sector that is roughly 90% self-sufficient. Iran is not a fragile island. It is a natural citadel that has survived centuries of Mongol, Arab, and British sieges, far more brutal than anything a modern carrier strike group can achieve. You cannot bomb a mountain range into submission. The Arab dictatorships in the Persian Gulf are the ones truly standing on the edge of the abyss, and they know it. These regimes, glittering cities of glass and gold built on the sand, are completely dependent on the export of oil and gas through a single, narrow choke point that Iran can close with drones. If Iran cannot use the sea to feed its people, it has made it clear that no one will. This is the Samson option of the Middle East, a reality that would vaporize economies. Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, and Kuwait would collapse within weeks, leading to internal revolts that no amount of American security assistance could suppress. The global energy crisis is a looming mathematical certainty. As the shortage of crude oil and essential petrochemicals intensifies, the pressure on the Trump administration from the industrial heartlands of Europe and Asia will reach a breaking point. The world will not blame the sanctioned state for the spike in prices. They will blame the regime in Washington that chose the path of war over a viable peace plan in Islamabad. The America First policy is about to collide with the reality of global interdependence. Financially, Tehran is in a position of unexpected and formidable strength. Before the first shot of this conflict was fired, they held a strategic reserve of 200 million barrels of oil on the high seas, stored in massive tankers acting as floating fortresses. They have already sold half of that at war-inflated prices to buyers who don't care about Washington sanctions, securing a massive reserve of foreign currency to weather the coming storm. They have another 100 million barrels ready to hit the market at the peak of the crisis, while their rivals in the West are running on empty strategic reserves and printing money. The ceasefire is viewed by the resistance as a tactical pause, a chance for both sides to reorganize their toolkit for the next, more violent phase of the struggle. The United States is moving 6 minesweepers into the region and increasing military aircraft activity across Europe, preparing for a long-term maritime confrontation. But the Iranians are not on vacation. They are working 24 hours a day in their underground missile cities to evolve their defensive and offensive postures. They are learning from every strike, every intercept, and every electronic warfare engagement. The 12-day war was a wake-up call that exposed the limitations of the qualitative military edge, QME. Iran responded to saturation strikes by manufacturing thousands of sophisticated decoys. These inflatable and wooden structures produce realistic heat signatures and radar cross-sections. They tricked the trillion-dollar intelligence apparatus of the West into wasting billion-dollar precision munitions on empty targets. They have restructured their missile bases to be emptied in minutes, utilizing automated rail systems that render the saturation strikes of the coalition largely ineffective. The shock and awe of 2003 is over. The survival of the Iranian military infrastructure after 40 days of the most intense bombardment since Vietnam is a brutal truth that Washington has yet to digest. The damage done was minimal. While the damage was minimal, the cost to the aggressors in terms of munitions, wear and tear on airframes, and global standing was astronomical. Every day the ceasefire holds, the pressure grows, shifting the leverage back to the axis of resistance. Time is a weapon, and Tehran knows how to wield it. In Lebanon, the situation is even more complex and volatile. The pro-Western political class attempts to sabotage the unified ceasefire to please their handlers. The Lebanese Prime Minister, installed under extreme external duress, has tried to decouple his country. By offering the South to the Israeli Air Force, he is seeking to impose a Zionist hegemony over a population that largely views Hezbollah as their only legitimate defense. The Iranian response to this perceived betrayal was swift, cold, and mathematical. They did not allow the agreed-upon number of ships to leave the Persian Gulf, further tightening the noose. This is the new reality of the Middle East. Every action by the Israeli regime or its subordinates has a direct, immediate, and painful consequence for the global economy. The era of localized conflict is over. We are now in the age of integrated, globalized warfare, where a drone in the Red Sea can shut down a factory in Germany. The aura of invincibility that once surrounded the Mossad and the Israeli armed forces has been shattered. They can claim they will not stop, but these are the desperate words of stagnation. Their fortunes are in terminal stagnation. Their economy is bleeding out, and their soft power has been obliterated by the haunting images coming out of the ruins of Gaza. They are a Sparta without the discipline, a Rome without the legions. The regimes in the Persian Gulf are beginning to realize that the United States will sacrifice them. American bases on their soil are not there for their protection. They are platforms for an aggression that puts their own electrical grids, desalination plants, and oil terminals at extreme risk. In a summer of extreme heat, the loss of power for 48 hours would mean the total collapse of these Vision 2030 societies. They are living in glass houses. The corruption of the regional leadership is deep and systemic, often tied to the same dark networks of control and blackmail seen in the Epstein files. These leaders are afraid. They are more afraid of their own disenfranchised people and their Western handlers than they are of a regional war. As the conflict escalates, the instability of these dictatorships will become primary. You cannot lead a nation while your heart is in a Swiss bank account and your loyalty is to a foreign intelligence service. The world is witnessing a new security paradigm. The United States is no longer the undisputed master of the board. Russia and Iran are standing as the primary challengers to an order that has failed to deliver peace. The Islamabad talks were the final warning, the last exit before the highway to hell. The next time the book is opened, the terms will be written in a new language. Washington, with its shrinking pool of competent diplomats and its obsession with identity politics, may not be able to translate. The era of the unipolar moment has been replaced. Global public opinion has shifted in a way that is irreversible. People across the world are viewing the axis of resistance not as terrorists, but as the only force against genocide. This soft power shift is more dangerous to the American empire than any hypersonic missile battery. It creates a qualitative edge that cannot be neutralized by aircraft carriers or billion-dollar propaganda. The moral high ground has been lost, and with it, the right to lead. As the 2-week ceasefire nears its inevitable end, the tension in the Strait of Hormuz is high. The global economy is holding its breath, a collective gasp before the plunge, waiting to see if the next move will be a return to the table with a sense of humility. In this matrix of choices, where every move is monitored by 1,000 sensors, the only certainty is that the status quo has been vaporized. There is no going back. The strategic paralysis in Washington is a symptom of a dying architecture that can no longer adapt to the reality of a world it no longer understands. They fight a ghost. The receipts of the past 40 years of intervention, subversion, and economic warfare are being called in. The price is higher than the empire can afford to pay without bankrupting its soul. The toolkit is empty, and the operational window is painted shut. The final reckoning will not be decided by who has the most stealth fighters or who can print currency. It will be decided by who can endure the longest in a world of broken supply chains, skyrocketing energy costs, and the total collapse of the rules-based order. Iran has been training for this marathon for nearly half a century, hardening its infrastructure and its people. The United States, distracted by internal rot, is starting to stumble. Stay sharp. The truth is not found in the teleprompters of the mainstream networks. It is being written in fire and steel on the battlefields of the Levant and the Gulf. The mainstream narratives are nothing more than a funeral shroud for a dying era, a desperate attempt to keep the public asleep while the foundation of their world is dismantled. The operational window for a diplomatic solution is closing with a deafening thud, and when it finally shuts, the sound will be heard in every capital on Earth, from London to Tokyo. The age of the geopolitical doom watcher has arrived, and the view from the edge of the abyss is unambiguous. The math does not lie, and the empire is out of time. Let us look closer at the receipts of the last 40 days. The coalition forces, led by the U.S., expended over 4,000 precision-guided munitions. The cost, roughly $8 billion. The result, a 14% reduction in Iranian short-range missile capacity, a capacity that Tehran replaced within 3 weeks through its decentralized underground manufacturing hubs. This is the mathematical asymmetry. You cannot win a war where your bullet costs more than the target it is designed to destroy, especially when the enemy has more targets than you have bullets. The strategic paralysis we see today is not just a failure of leadership. It is a failure of the very power architecture that has governed the West since 1945. The reliance on high-tech, high-cost platforms like the F-35 or the Gerald R. Ford-class carriers has created a fragile giant. These systems are magnificent in a vacuum, in a saturation environment where they are hunted by thousands of low-cost, expendable drones and subsurface gliders. They become liabilities. They are the crown jewels the empire fears losing. In the tunnels beneath the Zagros Mountains, the Iranian engineers are not just building missiles. They are building a new world. They are integrating Chinese satellite data and Russian suites. They use indigenous AI to create a kill web that covers the entire Middle East. When a Tomahawk is launched, it is tracked from the moment of ignition by passive sensors. These sensors do not emit a signal, making them impossible to target. This is the unambiguous reality of modern warfare. The defense has caught up to the offense. The cost of aggression has become prohibitive. The existential reckoning is not just for Washington, it is for the very idea of Western exceptionalism. The belief has been exposed. The belief that the world can be managed through sanctions and surgical strikes has been exposed as a mythology. The people of the global South are watching Islamabad. They are watching the Minab 168, and they are realizing that the giant has feet of clay. They are seeing that it is possible to say no and survive. This is the contagion of defiance that the empire fears most. It is the end of the unipolar era, not by a single blow, but by 1,000 cuts. As we move into the next phase of this crisis, the drip feed of information will become more chaotic. The mainstream media will try to frame the next escalation. They will frame it as a defense of democracy or a response to provocation. But you, the viewer, must look at the hard power reality. Look at the price of oil. Look at the movement of the minesweepers. Look at the empty shelves in the supermarkets of America's allies. These are the real-time receipts of a failing strategy. The lifeblood of the old world is draining away, and no amount of strategic communication can stop the bleeding. The toolkit of the geopolitical doom watcher is filled with truths. We do not look for hope. We look for operational realities. We do not listen to the official narratives. We listen to the syntactic rhythm of the battlefield. The staccato impact of the explosions in the Gulf is telling a story that the legato technicality of the diplomats cannot hide. The book is closed, the ink is dry. The next chapter will be written in the language of steel. Stay sharp. The cursor tack chin is narrowing. The tê liệt chiến lược is setting in. The sertengton singed tone is here. The world you knew is vaporized, and the world that is coming is unambiguous. The Bondschirm are all around you. Do not blink. The Kientriquaun Leet is falling, and the Surah Tankak is the only thing that will keep you alive in the Surbal of the conflict. History is not just lật sang trang mới. It is being rewritten by the kẻ quan sát tận thế. Địa chính trị. The end of the huyền thoại is the sự thật.